What if Imperial Germany had allied with Britain? It sounds impossible. Yet in 1898, Britain's colonial secretary quietly proposed a defensive treaty to Germany. The moment was real. Kaiser Wilhelm II refused, driven by pride, fear, and the dream of a navy to rival Britain's. His rejection triggered the arms race that turned future allies into enemies, setting Europe on a path to catastrophe. But it wasn't always his world to shape. Just a decade earlier, a different man, his father, briefly wore the crown. Could one man have stopped the war to end all wars? Frederick III, a liberal, an Anglophile, and Germany's last chance at a different path. His reign lasted 99 days. But what if he had lived? Inside the palace, a verdict is delivered. Kaiser Frederick III, newly crowned, is dying of throat cancer. The court is a gallery of unreadable faces: generals, junkers, ministers hardened by Bismarck's creed of iron and blood. This is a Germany where discipline and military tradition are sacred, and power flows not through the ballot box, but from the barracks. Everyone expects the same quiet outcome: a short ceremonial reign, followed by the real ruler Wilhelm II, who will take Germany down its destined path of expansion and rivalry. But something changes. The doctors are wrong. Frederick lives. A breath once thought to be his last becomes a turning point. The atmosphere in Berlin shifts. Eyes narrow. Calculations are redrawn. The old guard, so certain of a seamless transition, now faces a living anomaly. Frederick is not a dying idealist. He is a monarch with time, and his vision for Germany stands in direct contradiction to everything they've built. Frederick is no ordinary ruler. Raised in the shadow of Windsor Castle as much as the Prussian court, he is fluent not only in languages, but in political cultures. His marriage to Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, is more than a dynastic match. It's a lifeline. Through her, British constitutional ideals flow into Berlin. He hasn't just studied parliamentary monarchy. He believes in it. He imagines a Germany defined by its universities, its tolerance, and its citizens, not its generals. And that vision terrifies the establishment. To the conservative elite, Frederick's Anglophilia is a contagion. His son, Prince Wilhelm, already embittered by his father's ideals, begins aligning with General Alfred von Waldersee, the towering figure behind Germany's military command. Waldersee calls democracy a weapon of envy, warning that reform will ignite revolution. Whispers of disloyalty spread. Rumors circulate. In dark corners of the palace, some begin to speak of assassination. Not publicly, not yet. But the prayers for Frederick's death grow louder, even if spoken in silence. Frederick's survival throws their timeline into disarray. He is no placeholder. He is policy in motion. His first decision signals everything to come. He keeps Bismarck in power, not from affection, but out of necessity. Frederick loathes the Iron Chancellor's authoritarianism. Yet he knows that only Bismarck's political gravity can restrain Wilhelm and the military factions hungry to restore the old order. It is a calculated gamble, an alliance of rivals. And for a time, it works. Bismarck, ever the strategist, suppresses early dissent. He crushes reactionary noise, not for the sake of liberalism, but for order. Frederick uses the space to maneuver. His vision isn't declared all at once. It advances like a chess match, quiet, deliberate, and deeply disruptive. Diplomacy replaces belligerence. In 1890, Frederick moves to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia, originally signed in 1887 to prevent Franco-Russian alignment. The move sends a clear signal to Paris and London. This Germany values stability over saber-rattling. It's a signal Britain hears. The first real fruit of this shift is the 1890 Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. It trades a small African territory for a North Sea island on paper, modest. In practice, monumental. Heligoland strengthens Germany's defensive posture. Zanzibar cements Britain's colonial interests. No sabers are drawn. No ships dispatched. It is diplomacy, not deterrence. And it marks the beginning of an unthinkable alliance, Germany and Britain, not at odds, but aligned. Back home, the pressure builds. Frederick begins shifting power toward the Reichstag, drawing authority away from the military aristocracy and toward elected voices. He emphasizes education reform, religious tolerance, and constitutional balance. It's not revolution, it's evolution. But for the old elite, the effect is the same: erosion. Every new appointee, every expanded civil liberty, feels like an attack on the world they control. Waldersee and his circle sharpen their rhetoric. The reformers are painted as traitors. Britain, once the model, becomes the infiltrator. In public, they remain loyal. In private, they plan. The hope that Frederick will simply die fades. Now they reach for contingency. The palace grows watchful. Bismarck senses it first. He's too experienced not to. He advises caution in public statements. He delays Wilhelm's appearances. He reminds Frederick, subtly, that enemies within are more dangerous than enemies abroad. And Frederick listens. Every appointment is strategic. Every speech, coded. His reforms move forward, but always through layers of buffer civilian ministers, symbolic gestures, concessions to the center. He does not flinch, but he also does not provoke. Still, the atmosphere thickens. Doors close faster. Servants grow quiet. The lines between debate and treason blur. The battle for Germany's soul is no longer just parliamentary. It is personal. And somewhere behind the polished banisters and velvet curtains, the coup begins to take form. Because the old guard will not wait forever. In September 1891, as fog crawled through the boulevards of Berlin, the real battle for Germany's soul moved out of the Reichstag and into the shadows. The plan was audacious. Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee and his circle of hardliners would seize the Prussian Landtag, take control of the capital, and impose their vision by force. To them, Kaiser Frederick III wasn't just misguided. He was dangerous. A monarch infected with British constitutionalism, willing to trade swords for speeches, and determined to dismantle the Prussian legacy. In officers' clubs and candlelit drawing rooms, over late-night brandy and whispered fears, the plot took shape. The architects mapped every detail. Key regiments, targeted arrests, and the exact moment to declare Prince Wilhelm as the new Kaiser. Their goal was simple: strike fast, install the heir, and launch the war they believed would restore Germany's destiny. This wasn't just a power grab. It was a last stand. Every reform passed under Frederick, every shift toward parliament, tolerance, or diplomacy, was an assault on the foundations the generals had built their lives upon. The coup was their answer, their final strike before the world changed beyond recognition. But conspiracies rarely unfold as cleanly as they're imagined. The air in Berlin grew thick with suspicion. Guards rotated without warning. Ciphered messages ran late. The palace staff turned jumpy. Somewhere, perhaps a misplaced letter, a nervous aide, or a general with a conscience, the plan began to unravel. The exact moment of discovery is lost to history, but the outcome is not. On the eve of the coup, the plot collapsed. No riots, no storming of gates, no proclamations. Frederick's loyalists acted swiftly and silently. Waldersee and his inner circle were arrested in their homes. Officers who once toasted the empire's strength were quietly disarmed. The conspiracy was over by morning. For one conspirator, the shame was too much. Alfred von Balders, one of Waldersee's closest allies, took his own life before he could be apprehended. His act sent shockwaves through the capital. For the public, it wasn't just guilt, it was a confession with a bullet. The next morning, Berlin woke to black ink headlines. Treason in the palace. Crowds gathered in the streets, not to protest, but to protect. Citizens who once saw Frederick as a hesitant reformer now saw him as the man who stood between them and chaos. The attempted coup turned abstract politics into personal betrayal. It was broken by the generals. And with that breach came transformation. The failed coup gave Frederick something he had not yet possessed: undisputed authority. He moved quickly. Waldersee was dismissed. The officer corps was purged of its most dangerous nationalists. No mass trials, no gallows. Just quiet exile and permanent irrelevance. And then, with public support and the military shadow fading, Frederick made his boldest move yet. He asked Otto von Bismarck to retire. The Iron Chancellor had been Frederick's reluctant shield, useful in crisis, dangerous in peace. That time had passed. Bismarck, who once maneuvered behind the throne, was finally forced to leave it. The last great obstacle to reform was gone. What followed was not revolution, but recalibration. Frederick's centralized power curbed the autonomy of reactionary states and shifted the balance toward Berlin. With the Reichstag empowered and aristocratic vetoes broken, constitutional change accelerated. Education reform, labor protections, and civil liberties followed. The old order had tried to remove Frederick, and instead gave him the mandate to finish remaking the empire. But Germany's soul wasn't the only thing at stake. As stability returned to Berlin, eyes turned outward. For decades, German foreign policy had danced between isolation, aggression, and paranoia. But now, a new question returned with urgency. Could Britain and Germany become allies? Not just in philosophy, but in treaty? The failed coup had cleared the board. Now, Frederick was free to make his boldest diplomatic move yet. An alliance between Britain and Germany. On paper, it always sounded impossible. For decades, it had been dismissed as a contradiction in terms. But in this timeline, the impossible becomes not a matter of pride, but of policy. With Wilhelm II's voice confined to ceremonial duties, his father, Frederick III, reshapes Europe with the steady patience of a statesman. The alliance that never was in our history didn't fail for lack of interest. It failed because of one man's need to be feared rather than trusted. Under Wilhelm, diplomacy was theater. In 1896, the infamous Kruger telegram, Wilhelm's public congratulations to Boer rebels resisting British rule, landed in London like a slap across the face. It was a direct challenge to British imperial authority. It wasn't just tone deaf. Then came his obsession with battleships. The push to build a high seas fleet wasn't born of strategy, but ego and arms race for prestige rather than power. Britain, backed into a corner by naval provocation, turned to old enemies France and Russia for security. The future alliance was sunk not by principle, but by paranoia. But in Frederick's Germany, none of this happens. Frederick saw strength on land, not sea. He believed Germany's greatness came from education, industry, and order, not provocation. His naval policy was deliberate. No arms race, no oceanic ambitions. Germany's fleet remained coastal and defensive, sending a clear signal across the channel. We are not your enemy. This wasn't just policy. It was personal. Frederick's admiration for British governance, shaped over decades and deepened through his marriage to Princess Victoria, laid the groundwork for something far greater than détente. Unlike his son, he didn't imitate British power. He understood its foundations. And in that understanding, trust took root. Meanwhile, Britain was already searching for an anchor. In 1898, Joseph Chamberlain, Britain's colonial secretary, reached out privately to Berlin with a bold offer of mutual defense pact to counter French and Russian ambitions. Chamberlain saw the empire's pressure points: French agitation in Africa, Russian expansion in Central Asia. Germany, he believed, could be the partner Britain needed. In our timeline, Wilhelm's provocations made that alliance politically suicidal. But in Frederick's timeline, the path is wide open. Still, not everyone in Whitehall was convinced. Old fears lingered. Could Germany truly be trusted? Was this new Kaiser any different from the one who never stopped building ships? Frederick answered with silence. No threats. No bluster. Diplomats from both sides began meeting in secret just policy. A public commitment to keep the fleet static, a reaffirmed neutrality in Egypt, and quiet collaboration in Africa. The doubts faded, first in Brussels, then in Hamburg. There were no grand speeches, just maps, timetables, and shared objectives. Picture a dimly lit chamber in Whitehall, the air thick with pipe smoke. Across a long oak table, a German envoy places a velvet case on the desk and opens it. Inside, a signed treaty modest in length, seismic in consequence. One British official leans forward and mutters, "God help us, we've done it." The alliance is formalized. Its terms are simple, but its message is thunderous. Germany guarantees it will not threaten British naval supremacy. Britain, in turn, pledges to defend Germany's western borders if attacked. Colonies are divided by negotiation, not conquest. Trade routes are stabilized. A continent, long used to rivalry, awakens to a new and improbable friendship. The effects are immediate and far-reaching. France, already humiliated by the Franco-Prussian War, now finds itself cornered. Its alliance with Russia, signed in 1894, becomes little more than symbolic. Without the naval threat from Germany, Britain has no reason to seek out France in 1904. The Entente Cordiale never forms. With no one to back a war, there will be no war. No diplomatic warming, no shared strategic front. France, isolated, sees its revanchist hopes for Alsace-Lorraine fade into irrelevance. In Central Asia, Russia treads more carefully. Faced with a united front from London and Berlin, the Tsarist regime turns inward. The great game loses its urgency. Imperial friction cools under the weight of cooperation. And beyond strategy, something deeper begins to take shape. Two world powers, once defined by suspicion, begin to align not just militarily, but ideologically. Both are constitutional monarchies. Both value industrial stability and commercial expansion. Both now believe that peace can serve empires better than powder kegs. It's not utopia, but it is balance. The rigid blocks that once set Europe on the path to slaughter, Triple Alliance, Triple Entente never solidify, begins with the absence of one man's pride and the survival of another's principles. No clear sides, no countdown to Sarajevo. The mechanisms of inevitability are dismantled before they're ever assembled. And all of it, every treaty signed, every battleship never built. So with Britain and Germany aligned, the question is no longer whether war will come. It's who now feels most threatened by this new order and how far they'll go to break it. The world changes not with thunder, but with a cough in a palace bedroom. One man's survival, a failed coup, and an alliance once thought impossible, these are the pivots that turned the 20th century on its head. The Great War never comes. The trenches remain undug. In their place, joint German-British trade pacts in Africa, rail lines from Calais to Constantinople. Peace shaped not by fear, but foresight. The 1910s become a decade of diplomacy, not devastation. Vienna hosts summits, not ultimatums. Millions who would have died in the mud live to build, vote, and write. But even this alliance couldn't silence every storm. Rising U.S. industry and Japanese ambitions would soon test the edges of the order Frederick built. No peace is permanent, but some futures are worth imagining. If this alternate path through history made you think twice about what we take for granted, Like the video and subscribe for more journeys through what might have been.